Okay, welcome everybody to our final keynote session of the forum. I'm very excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Peter Stoett, who is a Dean and Professor for the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University. Prior to joining the university, Peter was Director of the Loyal Sustainability Research Center and Chair of the Department of Political Science at Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec. He has written, co-written, and co-edited more than 10 books and more than 55 peer-reviewed articles, chapters and edited books, and occasional papers. He has conducted research all over the world and has worked closely with many institutions, including the United Nations, the Canadian government, and the Hague Institute for Global Justice. Peter's main areas of interest for research include international relations and law, global environmental politics, and human rights, and he's especially interested in critical perspectives on the many nuanced intersections between these themes. His current research focuses on biodiversity conservation policy, transnational environmental crime, marine pollution prevention, climate justice, and Canadian-American environmental relations. In early September of last year, the Conference of the Parties of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES, approved the final draft of the IPBES assessment on invasive alien species and their control. Peter co-chaired this 4-year assessment, which involved over 150 experts in over 60 countries, which is absolutely incredible. So he's here today to talk about this assessment and some of the findings. We're really looking forward to it, Peter. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
All right, I'll stop sharing my screen. And when you start getting yours, while you're getting yours ready there, I'll just let everybody know that if you have questions for Peter at any time throughout his presentation, please pop them into the Q&A box and I will read them out loud for him at the end of his talk.
Okay. Okay, we're okay now, visually?
Perfect, yep, looks great.
Okay, well, thanks so much for having me. I hear your conference is going very well, so that's great. It's great to hear. And as was indicated, yeah, this has been the end of a 4-year process. So it was quite a relief when this assessment was finally accepted by the different governments that were in attendance at the conference in Bonn, where it was approved. So I'll talk a bit about what these assessments are and a little bit about our assessment in itself. I know that I'm speaking to a very educated crowd here, so I don't mean to belabor anything that you've already well aware of, but there are some things that we decided while doing the assessment that we would define invasive alien species a certain way, for example. So I'll come back to that. So science policy interfaces are increasingly important today, I think. Most multilateral environmental agreements involve some form of this. This is a typical definition now that they are social processes that encompass relations between scientists and other actors in the policy process, exchanges, coevolution, and joint construction of knowledge. So it's not just about assessing what's out there, what's happening. It's also a process, and that's important to keep in mind. Through the interactions over 4 years, we, I think, built well, I'm obviously prejudiced, but I think we built an outstanding community of scientists that were working on this topic. So the aim was to be policy relevant, not policy prescriptive. We're not here to tell governments what exactly to do. Our goal was to give them options, right? Solution-oriented assessments, basically. Decision makers have to balance competing priorities. As you know as well as anyone, those of you on this call, I think, are all engaged in invasive species prevention or control or management. So you know, right, that you're not always the priority. Balancing competing priorities is, of course, the task of politicians and policymakers. And yet, I think we made it quite clear through the assessment that invasive alien species should be a priority. So that's self-evident in my view. Many scientific disciplines, this is really important, highly interdisciplinary. As Madison introduced me, I'm a social scientist, so I focus on the social side. My co-chairs, however, Helen Roy from the UK and Bill Pouchard from Chile, are very much on the biological invasion side, right? And top world experts in that field. So, and other examples, everyone's heard of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And then, of course, we are part of IPBES, And there's also the Global Environmental Outlook, which is run by the United Nations Environmental Program and puts out a report every 3 or 4 years, assessing the overall state of the environment. And I've been heavily involved in that as well. I've been involved in all 3 of these. Our IPBES assessment developed over 4 years, 2019 and 23. We met in Japan. This was significant because our technical expert group, or sorry, not our technical support group, pardon me, was based in Japan. So the Japanese government helped fund a great deal of this assessment, for which we're very grateful. So we met in Japan, but we met also online. We met in Denmark. We had 2 external reviews. This went out to everyone globally. Anyone could comment on the drafts that we were evolving. We got 22,000 comments overall, and we had to respond to each of them, just to give you an idea of how extensive the review process is. And then there was an additional review at the end by governments. 142 governments are part of IPBES, and not all of them responded to that, but I'd say at least 80 of them did. And then we met in Bonn in Germany in late August and early September, where we had to present the report to 142 countries, which were there. And this was a quite laborious 4-day process of taking their comments, them debating amongst each other what the final version should look like, and so on. And the main debate there was over the summary for policymakers. So just very quickly, there's a summary for policymakers, which is a relatively short 30-page document. And then there is the assessment itself, which is an extremely long, over 1,000 pages, and counting probably, document. So the main thing that the governments are concerned about is a summary for policymakers, because that's what's read the most widely, and that's what actually calls on them to do things, right? So that's basically by agreeing on the summary for policymakers. These governments have all agreed that the action has to be taken on invasive species, and that the contents of the SPM should be respected. So it's similar to the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was accepted at the Convention on Biological Diversity in Montreal last year, or in 2022. Yeah. We had a lot of feedback, of course, from governments, and there were quite a few very interesting, spirited debates that took place amongst them in terms of what this final product would look like. But I want to really emphasize, it didn't impact the assessment itself in any way, right? So it's not a political process at the assessment level. If you want to look at our assessment, it's available on the IPBES webpage. And so, and an interesting thing about IPBES, by the way, if you have American viewers today, the United States is part of IPBES, and played a key role, I think, in many of our deliberations. It is not part of the Convention on Biological Diversity, as you might know, right? So there is American commitment for this as well. Canada played a key role. The Canadian delegation is always a pleasure to work with on these events. And yeah, so the Indigenous knowledge at the bottom here, we're stressing this because Indigenous and local knowledge, as IPBES, that's the phraseology IPBES uses, is often overlooked in these assessments, I think. Not in IPBES, though. IPBES really puts them as front and center as possible, right? That's one of the things that makes it unique. And I had, as a co-chair, of course, I was heavily involved in this aspect of the assessment. We held 3 dialogue workshops. We had one in Montreal at the Secretariat for the Convention on Biological Diversity. We had about 30 participants from around the world, from Indigenous communities that came in, including Canada and the United States, but also many Latin American, Asian, and African participants as well. And we also called for contributions from Indigenous communities. We collaborated with experts and holders, and we conducted an extensive literature review, which you'll see sort of peppered throughout the assessment itself, which I think is probably the most extensive literature review that's ever been done on the relationship between invasive species and indigenous peoples and their land. So quite pleased with that. We hope to have a separate publication coming out describing that. So roughly we had about 86 experts. Again, a real pleasure, although obviously a challenge, to work with this interdisciplinary group, right? It's not always easy to work on an interdisciplinary platform, as many of you might know. But I think we managed to come out very well with it. All regions of the earth were represented, many disciplines, about 200 contributing authors beyond the experts that worked with us directly. And again, the management committee was in Japan. And this is a picture of us there in Japan, actually on the stairs at our very first meeting, pre-pandemic. Wow. Long time ago. We've had, I think of this group alone, we've had 6 babies born, sadly, we lost a couple members, during this process. So 4 years is a long time. So in terms of invasive alien species, clearly one of the 5 major drivers of biodiversity loss. This is a conclusion that IPBES has reached a long time ago, but most particularly in its global assessment, which came out in 2019 and caused quite a stir, with its estimate that around 10 million species are at risk of extinction. Alien species, animals, plants, other organisms that have been introduced by human activities to new regions. That's important because we were really limited by our scoping document, which precedes the assessment, which governments put together, to focus entirely on alien species that have been introduced by human activities. So we're looking only at anthropogenic introductions. Now, that being said, we all know that climate change is driving some species to move and so forth. And you can argue climate change is a human-made condition. So there's some leeway there, but basically we are looking at introduction, either accidental or intentional, by humans. Invasive alien species, of course, are a subset of alien species, right? Known to have established and spread with negative impacts on nature. And I can expand on this, but we were really focused again on those species having negative impacts, right? And we had extensive reviews to ascertain species, many of which are pictured here, of course, which actually have those impacts. So what we did during the assessment was we tried to broaden this out a bit, and this was largely to, I think, satisfy the scientific curiosity and ambition in the group to not just talk about species, right? We wanted to talk about the process of biological invasion. We wanted to talk about not individual species entirely, right? We certainly, great deal of focus on that, don't get me wrong, but we wanted to look at the process of biological invasion instead. And we use this term to describe the process involving the intentional or unintentional transport or movement of a species outside its natural range by human activities, and its introduction to new regions where it may become established and spread. That might seem like common sense to you. That took us I think it was literally about 10 hours of negotiation with with these governments that I mentioned to arrive at that final definition. So that gives you an idea of how painstaking these deliberations can be. But we're hoping that this becomes a term that gets, of course, widely adopted in the process. So from transport to introduction to establishment and spread, this is very common, of course, in biological invasion, to use these stages, right, of the invasion process. And then we have definitions here as well, as you can see, of native species, alien species, established alien species, right? And then finally, invasive alien species, right? So these are the ones, again, spread by humans, demonstrable, right? Or recorded, to use that term, negative impacts, usually recorded by observers such as yourselves working in the field, governments, in some cases, as I mentioned, indigenous people, and others less connected maybe to the formal scientific process, right? Nonetheless, identified still. And introduction pathways, this is very important, the many ways in which species are moved from one location to another by human activities. Drivers or factors that directly or indirectly cause changes to nature and may facilitate in biological invasions as well. So I mentioned climate change before, land use change. Basically, all the threats to biodiversity are also drivers of biological invasions. And invasive alien species are drivers of invasive alien species, as you might know, because sometimes they pave the way for easier adaptation, right, by non-established species to establish themselves. Negative impacts, negative changes to nature, nature's contributions to people, which is IPBES a way of saying ecosystem services, by the way. I realize there's some confusion about that sometimes. And or good quality of life, and that refers to basically to the human condition, right? So whether that's employment, sustenance, health, culture, mental health, and so forth, right? So that's what good quality of life refers to. So the main findings of the report, first of all, this shouldn't surprise anyone, but people in nature are threatened by invasive alien species in all regions of Earth. Right? There wasn't one area we could look at where there wasn't a serious threat, and this included Antarctica, by the way. So our surveys indicated around 37 established alien species have been introduced by human activities worldwide. There are roughly 200 new alien species being recorded every year. Of the 37,000 alien species, and by the way, this doesn't go back to time immemorial. If I get a question about that, no. It goes back to, most of the records on this go back around 200 years or so, okay? Some of them, however, are recordings of species that it's been quite evident that they were not native species, right? So, and around 200 new alien species are being recorded every year now. Of the 37,000 established alien species, we found there's around 3,500 invasive alien species that are having negative impacts on nature. Most of them also have negative impacts on people. Some of them are in areas where you can argue, that there's limited impact on people, but that's a minority. More than 2,300 invasive alien species found on lands of indigenous peoples across all regions of Earth. So this is a global threat. This is an important thing to keep in mind as we address the world community with this. Impacts from invasive species are reported in the Americas. So we looked at these are percentages here of where, most of the impacts are being found, right? Most of them in the Americas, North and South, Europe and Central Asia, and Asia Pacific. There were fewer reported in Africa, but I want to stress something. It's very important in the African case, which is that there have been limitations, rather severe in some cases, in terms of reporting, right? In terms of establishing and data. And Africa, of course, is a continent where there is less scientific infrastructure, right, to get these reports. So when we presented this to the conference in Bonn, the African countries actually were quite upset because they said, no, I know there's no way we have less impacts than, let's say, Latin America does. Well, we can only report what we found, right? So that's what we had to keep telling them. However, it was very important in our report that we suggest that there be big improvements in data collection around the world, and that this sort of capacity building is necessary. And so we need more research. We need it in places, some of the countries in Africa in particular. There's a wide discrepancy there. South Africa is one of the most advanced when it comes to invasive alien species research and data collection. South Africa is. But then if you go slightly north of South Africa, you'll be in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has been suffering civil war for the last 30 years, and there's hardly any reporting, right? So we have to keep all this in mind, I think, moving forward. 75% of negative impacts were reported from terrestrial, right? Especially temperate and boreal forests and woodlands and cultivated areas. Only 14% were from the freshwater realm, especially from inland surface waters and water bodies, rivers and lakes in particular, and 10% from the marine realm, right? Mostly in the shelf ecosystems. So again, recalling what I said about the global distribution here, this also reflects bias in data collection. The marine realm in particular, one thing that I think I really learned from doing this assessment is that we do not have the kind of data we'd like to when it comes to marine invasive species. It's improving, absolutely, right? But it's not there. And the experts that we had on board that specialized in marine were the first to agree, right? That this is something that governments have neglected, and or it's something that's just too difficult to gather, right? We still haven't mapped the entire ocean surface and ground, right? So we're still working on things like this, of course. So I say all this as a prelude to say, you know, these are not. This is not perfect information. Perfect information doesn't exist when it comes to biodiversity, right? We deal with what we can. We're finding there's more and more new ways of getting information. For example, satellite data, right? Satellite visualing, remote sensing. That's just coming on board now. So it's going to be fascinating, I think. And given the efforts that are going into invasive species prevention and control, it'll be fascinating to take this 10 years from now and do a follow-up assessment and see how these numbers change, see how these colors change here on our global distribution and so forth. Will we know more about what's happening in the deep oceans, for example, right? Will we know more what's happening in remote forest areas that scientists really haven't been able to go in and do specific studies or what have you? A lot of that's going to change, I think, with some of the remote sensing and satellite data that people are starting to collect now. Very interesting, but very expensive to do. So we found that around 60% of global extinctions have been caused solely or alongside other drivers by invasive alien species. Right? And around 16% of global extinctions have been caused solely by invasive alien species. This is very important because extinctions are often viewed, you know, as the worst case scenario when it comes to biodiversity conservation. Right? Invasive species play a major role here. There were 1,215 documented local extinctions of native species that were caused by invasive alien species. Many of you have heard of probably the story of the island of Guam, where the brown tree snake has gone in and basically wiped out the entire bird population, right? Or you've heard other horror stories like Lake Victoria in Africa, where the Asian carp has wiped out entire species of fish. This has happened, however, much more globally than we're thinking, right? So, and again, you know, specific questions, that's my scientific colleagues are much better at answering and giving you examples. They can go on all day about them, but they're all in the assessment, well documented. And we found that 85% of the impacts in nature are negative. This is really important because there's a bit of backlash, right, about working with invasive alien species or trying to do something about them. The backlash comes from numerous places. You've probably been exposed to this. Well, you know, they're still species. They still have a right to live and everything. Yes, of course. But right, they're doing more damage than their absence, right? What would be done in their absence. And there's some debate about this, you know, is the overall impact, is it really that negative? We found that of the impacts that invasive species are having on nature in particular, right, on ecosystems, about 85% of them, in other words, the vast majority are in fact negative, right? It's hard to argue what is a positive impact of invasive alien species. We can get into that if you wish, but I think ultimately it's important to keep this in mind. Overwhelming evidence that this is a major threat to nature. right? Invasive species change ecosystems entirely, right? And that hurts every species that lives in that ecosystem. In many cases, they're predative, right? They're herbivory. That was about 18 and 12% respectively in terms of the negative impacts. And of course, they compete with native species, right? And they outcompete. The ones that are successful, that's why they tend to be so, have outcompeted with native species, right? So, and that's found in around 24% of the cases. There's also other mechanisms that we refer to, hybridization, which dilutes biological DNA and so forth, transmission of disease, parasitism, poisoning, toxicity, biofouling. This is especially important when it comes to the marine and inland water systems that I mentioned. Chemical, physical, structural impact on ecosystem, and indirect impacts through interactions with other species as well. So one thing that we found, this shouldn't surprise anyone, but yeah, really major cause of biodiversity loss on islands. 20% of all impacts are reported from islands. 90% of documented global extinctions as one of the major causes with invasives is one of the major causes reported from islands. Number of alien plants exceeds the total number of native plants on more than 1/4 of islands globally. Right? Again, imperfect information. We don't have every island, but from the studies we were able to find. Islands are also vulnerable to climate change, of course, as you know, especially extreme weather events and drought and so forth, which can increase the rate of establishment and spread of many species. So we do spend quite a bit of time on islands in the assessment. They are at particular risk. Invasive species impact people, economies, food, water security, human health. 80% of documented impacts on nature's contributions to people are negative. Food supply is by far the most frequently reported impact. Right? So it's important to what are often called agricultural pests, right? If they are viewed or can be viewed if they've gone through the invasion cycle or process, those are invasive alien species, and they are wiping out entire food sources. And not just, I don't just mean agriculture in terms of plants or wheat or what have you, but also, excuse me, fish, which I mentioned previously, and other sources of food. So global annual costs, this is from a database which some colleagues of ours developed sort of in tandem with the species, or sorry, with our assessment. The estimate that we came up with was $423 billion a year. That this is what biological invasions are costing, right? And that involves food loss, right? Some of this cost is related to management expenditures, of course, right? But to those that say, well, that only costs so much because you're trying to do something about it, that's nonsense. Just to keep that clear, only about 8% is related to management expenditures. Right? The rest of it is related to lost opportunities when it comes to food production, ecotourism, the loss of endangered species, and so forth, right? So we expand on that in considerable length. If you haven't heard of it, it's called InvaCost, is the name of the study that we base it on. Now there are other estimates. There are estimates that go into the trillions, right? There are estimates that are lower and so forth. So we arrived at this one by consensus. Again, experts around the world agreed that this is the one we would stick with for the assessment purposes, and 142 governments accepted it. Indigenous peoples have already mentioned disproportionately impacted, right? There's no question about that. And they often are yes, on the one hand, they've got limited access to the political clout that's necessary to actually take steps to either prevent or manage invasive species as well. But one thing I want to stress about that 423 billion, we call that really the tip of the iceberg, because it doesn't take into account so much labor that goes into dealing with the impacts of invasive species. Whether it's weeding, your back lawn, for example, right? Let's say you've got invasive species in your own garden, and you're spending time doing that. That doesn't go into that 423 billion. Well, magnify that or amplify that, if you will, tremendously, because that's what's going on around the world as people are adjusting as well. So it also doesn't take into account the cultural side, right? So when you lose a species to biodiversity loss, there's a cultural impact there, right? And that's very difficult to measure or quantify. So again, this is just a big stat sheet that we like to share, giving some examples. European shore crab in North America, for example, decimated commercial shellfish beds in New England and Canada. The citrid fungus in Central America, severe global declines of amphibians, as we're all aware of, right? And we include, by the way, fungi as invasive species in cases where it's been demonstrated that they are. We also look at Japanese knotweed, brown tree snake, I already mentioned, buffalo grass in Australia, Nile perch. Sorry, I mentioned the Asian carp yesterday. Or earlier. I was mistaken about that. Sorry, it was a Nile perch in Lake Victoria. The Asian carp, of course, is our North American friend, right? who's doing some damage in the Mississippi. The little fire ant in tropical Africa, the branch pipe coral of South America. These are just some examples, of course, right? But more importantly, I think on this graph is, that we've got the economic costs of biological invasive species has increased fourfold every decade over the last 4 decades or so. So the costs are increasing as we're moving along. There's no doubt about that. Current policies, basically, right, globally, obviously, if this is the case, that we've got these increases, we're not dealing with this on a global level. Most countries have targets for the management, about 80% of them. 83% of countries, however, do not have national legislation or regulations directed specifically towards invasives. And nearly half of all countries do not invest in the management in any way. And so this is something we found over the last 10 years or so. Things are gradually changing. Some of these statistics are a little out of date, so we don't know, right? There could be some improvement since then. So these are just some more numbers on impacts. I've already been over these, I think, so I'll skip this one. Every region, and also we're finding right across taxa, right? So we've got these increases, whether it's fungi, mollusks, crustaceans, insects, what have you, right? So the news is bad, folks, overall. And we're also concerned about how invasives are helping to facilitate climate change, increasing and amplifying the threats and impacts, and how climate change will also be a major a cause of future increases, but invasive species can also be a driver of climate change, right? And those of you that are familiar with the horrendous fires in Hawaii, and some of that was caused arguably because there's an invasive grass, right, that grows quite widely in Hawaii, which caught fire very rapidly and so forth. So forest fires are a major concern. I'm actually attending next week in Vancouver a special workshop just on forest fires and invasive species. And my colleague, Anibal, will be presenting, because that's really his expertise, are forests and forest fires related to invasives. So people are at the heart of the problem, right? And there's no question about it. It's human activities that are spreading invasive species right now, right? And our prediction is that you're going to have at least 1/3 higher in 2050 than we had in 2005 when it comes to the total number of species, alien species. Keep in mind that not all alien species turn out to be invasive, right? But at least 10% tend to. So economic activities, we found very clearly the volume of commodity imports increases. So with increased trade, we have increased invasive species. Biosecurity measures have not kept pace. And so projected growth in the movement of trade and people, including tourism, will lead to further pressure on border inspection regimes. But people are also at the heart of solutions, right? And this I'll skip through relatively quickly because I know that people here are working in this area already. But we looked essentially at three management options. Pathways, right? The management of pathways, very important. Obviously, the management of target invasive alien species, which is probably where most of you work, either at the local or landscape scale, right? And site-based or ecosystem-based management, including restoration efforts, right? So, and the top picture there actually is my co-chair, Annie Bell, who's that's him in the front in the hat, who's working on measuring some. I think they were looking for invasive. That's an invasive spruce in Chile that's starting to take over. But yeah, and then there's also, of course, at the bottom, this poor guy trying to clean the hull of what looked like perhaps zebra mussel or something like that. So there's a management invasion continuum. We focus on this in the assessment also, management objectives and targets. We're finding that this knowledge is out there, right? There's such a wealth of it. Don't have time to expand on it, obviously, in terms of what people are doing, that we're able to put something like this together that I think captures most of what's happening one way or another, right? And it's very clear that prevention is the most cost-effective option. That's a real point that we stress in the assessment, right? Prevention must be achieved through pathway management, strictly enforced import controls, pre-border, border, and post-border biosecurity. It's not just a invasive species problem. It has to be also dealt with in an integrated fashion by other parts of government. I'll come back to that momentarily. Particularly important on islands, that's self-evident, I think, at this stage, but also critical in marine and connected water systems, because attempts at dealing with it in any other way there have mostly failed. Right? It's extremely difficult to get rid of a invasive species once it's established in a marine environment. So we need adequate funding, we need capacity building. And all this was accepted by the government. So if you're going to the government saying you need money to work on a project, please use the assessment, because that's what it's there for, right? Eradication. We spent a lot of time on this, obviously, the moral questions around eradication, right? Eradication's been very successful, especially for small and slow spreading populations, especially in isolated ecosystems, especially on islands. Eradication is arguably necessary, right? But we all know how difficult it can be and publicly contentious as well. So containment and control, and then the recovery of ecosystem functions. So back to the restoration question, which is really picking up now as people are getting into rewilding and things like this. What role will invasive species play? What role will they play when we are translocating species, right, due to climate change, species that are being harmed perhaps, and we're relocating them with the hopes that they'll thrive somewhere else? Are there adequate research being done to ensure that we're not moving invasive species someplace? So engagement with stakeholders, absolutely essential. Indigenous peoples as well, right? So we found that successful management was predicated in many cases on local contributions, on the engagement of local people, right? You can't work without it, right? So this is a picture here of some people trying to deal with water hyacinth, right? But many examples of this. And we also found that on a positive note, if you can control invasive alien species, you can strengthen the effectiveness of policies designed to respond to other threats to biodiversity, right? This contributes to these several sustainable development goals. Governments liked hearing that, of course. And in December, we had as I mentioned before, the Condé Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. We were also there, by the way, for those negotiations. Very contentious at points, but finally, right, arrived with a global biodiversity framework. And there is a particular article which deals specifically with alien species. So again, if you're looking for something to back up a proposal or a claim that we've got to work on this, as governments have to work on this, remind them that your government signed this framework. And beside this, you see the tree, which we come up with, which we came up with as our sort of integrated governance design. Keeping in mind that at the bottom, the roots, these are all things that we think are necessary for any sort of effective environmental governance to take place. It has to be equitable and inclusive, effective implementation, responsive governance, and robust institutions. Right? But at the top, we have more specific suggestions. And one of the ones, the one in the center there is to enhance coordination and collaboration amongst international and regional mechanisms, absolutely essential. And we do include in the assessment and in the summary for policymakers, there is a very succinct summary, I think, but of the some of the knowledge sharing, data sharing mechanisms that are out there. And they're quite extensive, actually, right? What we need to do is link them all together more effectively. But there are all, you're familiar with the IUCN probably, and its red list. It also has a list of invasive species, for example. Governments keep their own lists, right? And we share it through various means. More has to be done. And again, filling these data gaps as well, right? So the strategic actions that I mentioned, up to the top, this is just another graph or visual that we put together. Stages, levels, and scales, management actions. I won't belabor this because I think we're running out of time. In conclusion, there's compelling evidence for immediate and sustained action. We need sufficient resources. We need long-term commitment. This is very important. That includes monitoring, right, and surveillance about effectiveness. Prevention absolutely is the key, however. I'll keep coming back to that because if you don't prevent these problems, they become so much worse. And of course, the cost, right? We've had great success with the report. These are some of my authors here from around the world, as I said, that were at the actual meeting where we met. I always love this picture because this is when we finally came to a conclusion and everyone was clapping. And they stood up after this, actually. It got even more emotional. Yeah, we received a great deal of international attention when this came out. Some of you might have seen it in the newspapers or what have you. And I think we got off to a very good and strong start. This was in September, October last year. Media coverage was amazing. We had articles in over 50 languages in over 100 countries that focused on the assessment. I think I was interviewed 30 times or something. And I know Helen is like the super person of invasive species globally right now. And I think she's still interviewing, like, she must have done over 200 interviews or something, just fantastic. We were covered by the BBC, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CBC in the Canadian case, and so forth. So the coverage was very good, but, right, that comes and goes. That's like a big flare and it's nice. And all of a sudden everyone cares about invasive species again for a bit. And then it just sort of drops by, as you might know, right, as happens with many issues. So the emphasis really is that people like yourselves that are carrying and working on these issues, you've got to keep it alive. We've got to keep pressure on governments to keep doing things and investing long term. Canada needs a new invasive species, I think, framework or strategy. It has had one for a while, and I know that there's efforts underway, right, to work on that. So that's fantastic. And then, of course, in the Canadian case, you've got federal and provincial governments and local governments. It's a multi-governance issue, right? So you really need to put pressure, I think, on all these areas. But we've had some good feedback so far. For example, a national communication strategy has been aligned with the language of the assessment in Belgium, Chile, France, right? With the translation, the summary was translated, by the way, for policymakers. And this is Helen at the bottom here, by the way. So I always got to make sure I show Helen because she did such wonderful work on this. The summary for policymakers is out in all UN languages. Okay, so that includes Chinese and Russian and so forth. Yeah. But we are having it right now. It's being translated into Korean and Japanese, right? And there will be others that follow. Obviously, there's a Spanish translation, but there's a Portuguese language translation coming as well. Very important for Brazil, for example. We've been making some of these presentations all over the place. The most recent one we made, really, or one of the most recent ones, was in Tokyo to the G7, to the group of G7 countries, in which they adopted a communique promising to keep working on the invasive species problem. So that was a real, I think, a real big moment for us to work with them on the language of that communique, which is available on the web and so forth. And again, another pressure point, right? If you're looking for suggestions. Private sector, we're getting some action there in terms of corporations that are more and more aware of this problem, because we did find, I think, during the assessment that corporations aren't, generally speaking, aware of this. They all know about climate change, and they all know about, land use change in some cases, at least, or right, but invasive species, unless you're directly working in that area, which is, of course, a major exception. Australian government contributed or committed over $2 million for the control of buffalo grass in South Australia, and cited our assessment and said, thank you for the assessment. So things are starting to happen as a result of it. And that's our hope, is that more things will happen. So thank you, Madison. I know I've probably taken longer than I should have.
No worries at all. It's worth it to hear all your valuable information. Thank you so much for that presentation. It's amazing to hear how much work went into this assessment. I can tell why it was a 4-year project. And listening to you talk, I can't imagine responding to 22,000 comments. That stuck out to me in the beginning of your talk. That must have been so much work.
Yeah,
We do
I should stress that I didn't personally respond to all of them,
yes,
but
still for you and your whole team. That's a lot
between
of
the team,
comments.
yes, yeah, no, it was a lengthy process, but peer review is, there's great things about it, and there's tedious things about it, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and many people have their own agendas. They're trying to push the assessment in one direction or another, but by and large, extremely helpful.
Yeah.
You think you've got 86 ex-authors on something, you're not going to miss anything, but you do invariably, right? You miss things, and so that process picks it up.
Definitely. Yeah, well, thank you so much. That's so great. Lauren did post a number of links in the chat for anybody interested. We do have the link to the assessment posted if you want to learn more. We have a number of really great questions. I'll try and get through some of them, but if not, we're not going to get through all of them for sure. But we'll post Peter's email in the chat box for follow-up later if you want to. So I'll start with a couple questions here. Does the global distribution of established alien species map consider establishment in inland lakes? Are the Great Lakes included?
Yes. Yes, I believe, yes, they should be, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, awesome.
Great Lakes, well, so you're referring to the North American Great Lakes, right?
Mhm.
Not the African, but yeah, in the Great Lakes, of course, we've got tremendous problems, as everyone knows already, with the zebra mussel and other mollusks and so forth, right? But one of the biggest threats, of course, is that Asian carp that I mentioned, which we're so afraid of it moving in, and that would change things, I think, considerably if that happens.
Oh, absolutely. So you mentioned how expensive globally invasive species management costs. Sounds like a huge problem. How can we as environmental and scientific communicators effectively get this point across?
Well, again, I would just keep hammering it home to people that the costs of inaction are so much greater than the cost of prevention, right? And we see this time and time again, right? Responding to these problems is much more expensive than trying to take some preventive measures. So now we don't have, I'm often asked this, what exactly would it cost to put everything we suggest in the assessment into place? Right? And I'll be honest there, we don't know, right? There's no doubt that we're looking at spending serious money, right? But there's no way we're looking at spending $420 billion a year on it, right?
Right.
Yeah, I think, most governments, we're lucky if most are spending, in the millions when it comes to invasive alien species prevention, right? And in the Canadian case, I think we could certainly be doing more as well, right? So,
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of questions here. I'll ask just one more because I'm also curious about this one. This person here says, well done on such a comprehensive report. Were there any learnings that surprised you and your colleagues?
I think that one of the main things that surprised us were the data gaps that I mentioned. You know, that we have such large areas, and I'm picking on Africa, but it's not just Africa, and it's also in areas of Asia. It's also, you know, there's still arguably, right, Canada's so large, there's limited information as well. Um, and just how imperfect, you know, the information is. I think maybe my scientist colleagues weren't as surprised by that, right? But as a social scientist, I'm used to uncertainty, right? We never know exactly what, you know, what makes humans do what they do and so on, but we have lots of theories. Um, but I assumed moving in that we would be able to get some really, you know, granular data on every area of Earth, and we just can't do it right now, right? So I think that was surprising to some extent. I think also though that another thing that really springs to mind was all of the concerted actions that are going on, many of which slips under the radar as well, right? That governments are even unaware. When we had our Indigenous workshops, many of them were able to tell us, right? The Indigenous peoples that, you know, we've been doing this for years. We've been responding. We've been fighting invasives for years, keeping them out of our area. You know, and this is how we're doing it, right? Specifically, right? And so on. And a lot of that information, yeah, I think that surprised a lot, even my colleagues on the management front, because they weren't aware of it, you know, what's already happening, right? Which is so commendable and I think hopeful, right? If I can end up on an optimistic note, right? Is people are ingenious, right? And people will adapt, and people will take the necessary uh, community engagement and cooperation, right? Um, to protect themselves from a common ecological threat, right? Just seeing that the extent to which that's occurred, I think, was really heartwarming and hopeful. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, what a great way to end end your session here. Thank you so much, Peter. We have run out of time, but we have put your email info in the chat box for anybody interested in following up. But thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise. We really appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Take care.
Awesome. Well, we have one more session left of the forum that you won't want to miss. So tune in to the invasive aquatic plant session at 1:30 to hear about updates on water soldier, the inside scoop on the European water chestnut rapid response program, and the current status of biological control of introduced Phragmites in Canada. So see you soon, just in 5